Or
Yep.
cool. Let me switch over. All right. Let me actually pull that out so that I can keep y'all up where I can see. So the first question I have for everyone is the exact same as last week. Was there anything this week that y'all learned or that stood out to you from the reading? And we can go ahead and I'll just kind of actually go down the list so that we're kind of moving. And I'll actually start with my mom.
You caught me. I was looking in the book to pick up the pages here. Well, there are lots of things, so I'm just going to focus on the one that just stood out to me this in reading is they talked in a part here about how Jesus continually went by himself or his disciples would go with him and wait while he prayed. And it wasn't unusual for him to pray. You know, he'd go there in the night and pray all night. And I just found that reassuring and, maybe something that I need to do more of. Maybe not all night long, but at least more prayer. If Jesus sets that example, maybe we need to follow that more.
Well said. The Chesvolts. What about y'all?
I had to say something.
I can't think of anything just offhand.
It was something I thought of and then I don't remember. I thought it was interesting to have those 5 different ways that I think it was the disciples were called. 5 things happened. I think that's what it was. It was right towards the end. Like the first one was why they were, the learning process was difficult for them. That was a part that was interesting. It was like, first of all, they lacked spiritual understanding, and then they had they weren't humble. They lacked humility. They also lacked faith, and they lacked commitment and power. I thought all of those are really interesting. It just kind of made me think a little bit about, I guess we all have those same things once in a while. Maybe that's what was making me think of that.
Yeah, the whole book is really saying they were us.
Mm-hmm.
They were called by Jesus, literally sat at the campfire with him and learned at his side, where we're now learning from them.
Yeah, and they also didn't get called right away. That's the other part I didn't paid much attention to. It was like they were in that large group of people that all went together, and then all of a sudden then after a while, Jesus called those 12, and I thought that was very interesting. So I guess I didn't think of it that way. I thought he just called one, then he called another one. I didn't think about all the stuff that happened first. I guess that's what I was thinking. That just was, they all did it at once. But no, it took a while, and that was interesting to me. So
that's what I was kind of surprised about, that he had so many disciples. I grew up with that. Okay, he had 12 disciples, but that wasn't really true.
Then the apostles were a different thing. That was the other thing. It was not the same thing, and I thought that was interesting too. I always thought that was like interchangeable. I guess it's not. So that was interesting.
Hi, Kimball and Teresa. Right now I'm asking the same question from last week, which was, what kind of stood out, or what did you learn from this week's reading? And let's see, Susan. So Lorraine, do you have anything from this week?
I guess I'm thinking one of the things that really touched me was when he was talking about the training, how they came for training and then they went back to their ordinary jobs and everything, but how it talked about that this was the best seminary education ever. And they were so simple that they just, they weren't filled with biblical knowledge like all the scholars were. And so it was really easy for them to, well, not always easy, but easier for them to have the faith and the foresight to believe what they were learning. But when I read that part about the best seminary education ever, it kind of made me chuckle. I thought that was pretty cool.
Let's see. Jim Langers, what about y'all two?
Well, like Susan and Karen, I was intrigued with the number of disciples. They said at least 70 and possibly well over 100 different disciples. And then I was also intrigued at how Jesus was able to train the disciples to do miracles. And so it apparently it doesn't take somebody with Jesus's particular skill set to be able to do that. And so it made me start thinking, well, maybe maybe it was a lot like modern medicine or something. Maybe they had certain techniques, like creating mud to get rid of cataracts and something like that. That he explained at one point in time. Where so I found that to be very interesting.
The first thing in this half chapter that when I was reading was how so many cathedrals, like over in Europe, they glorify the disciples. They put out huge statues. It's almost like a means of worshiping them. And also today in the Catholic Church, they have their icons. But I hadn't thought of these glorified structures as being ordinary men at one time. I just thought of them as being very blessed to be within the teaching and the training of Jesus.
Cheryl, what about you?
Here we go. It was pretty much at the start of this section. See if I can summarize it. The fact that Jesus was praying the prayer of God. He wasn't praying to God. It was actually, let's see what they called it, intertrinitarian communion, which I'd never thought about. For some reason, I always left off the Holy Spirit anyway, but because if God is, if Jesus was praying to his Father, I don't know why. But anyway, so I thought that was just a different time. It was obviously something I didn't know, and we do lose a lot when you translate from Greek, how it was written, versus in different parts of this, they'll talk about where there's the Greek word for it, but then there's the Aramaic word for it, which was actually what Jesus would have spoken. So I always find that interesting that we have lost something in the translation.
Very true. So then I'll go back and I'll ask Teresa, did you learn anything or anything stand out?
One of the things I underlined was, I had it just a minute ago, where it says, but instead of whitewashing the blemishes, Scripture seems to make a great deal of their human weaknesses. It's a brilliant reminder that our faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. And just, again, to reiterate what you said, this whole book is about saying they are us. And it's very humbling.
That's kind of inspiring to me.
Yeah, inspiring and humbling. Yes, I agree.
And then Kimball.
Good evening. I got to make sure I press the mic button and not the other red one like I've been known to do. So, I kind of, well, first off, I agree with comments about the fact that I always use disciple and apostle kind of synonymously. And I think 70 might be a bad number for disciples now, because as I understand it now, the disciple is somebody that's following and learning. And he had 5,000 out there he fed. So how many did he really have? But I was taken aback when he first talked about his sacrament, putting them off, and some of them left. And this book is making me look at things at different angles. That's kind of like, at my first blush, that's like devil worship, and I might be kind of put off by that. He rebuked them for being slow learners, yet he chose people purposely for being so uncommonly common. I got too many things highlighted in here. He was still persistently teaching them until the moment he ascended, and had the Holy Spirit come down and infuse them with power to carry on his work. I think that's where they got. They were not prepared until that moment, in my mind. I didn't know that he sent them out on kind of in test markets to train them to work without him, which now that I know that makes perfect sense. We're used to following you, but how do we learn to step out of the follower role if we don't get a chance to step out? They lacked commitment. I mean, all the things that he said about them as not being, the way I read it, worthy or up to the task. But yet they were the ones that he prayed. The comment here in John 17 that he prayed that they would remain faithful. He was praying for them to persevere. They couldn't understand that their faithlessness was taking their power away. I'm sorry, I've got so many things. I don't know that there's a highlight other than I didn't want to stop reading. And incidentally, I had a client today that is a Baptist preacher that I met, and I had 5 minutes worth of work, and I spent an hour and a half having a discussion with him on the chosen and on this and on the silly issues of today. He's a black man, and I've never been as blessed as the conversation I had with him today. So we talked about Galatians. He gave me a test. He has a Bible study going on in Galatians right now. The apostles, they scattered when Jesus was arrested. I never really, maybe I knew that, but I never knew that they scattered. They were afraid then. It was over. I always knew that they scattered when he died. They thought it was over. But, I mean, how quickly we deserve a sinking ship.
That's right.
All the time.
They were the ones that he chose.
And I think he kind of knew that they would scatter.
He knew it all. This book is, so far, has gotten me to look at things in such a different light and really provoked me into thinking about things differently. I still am in awe of the fact I shared today that The Bible stories are good, but they gloss over, they make everything warm and fuzzy. I never realized that by the time Jesus started his mission, this 3-year mission, that he was already on a death list. And that persecuted, to me, that's the last 6 months leading up to Easter. I mean, it's, or has been. And to be able to do all this and living in that type of circumstance is something in itself.
Well, and I think because we stick to the seasons, it kind of negates really that timeline that Christ had, just because we try to keep everything situated for the day, for the season, for Christmas, for Easter. Karen, did you have anything to add? I know you interjected at one point, but did anything stand out for you?
Not particularly at this point.
Well, unless Eric and Nathan have something to add, I actually learned something on this reading, or reread. So, Eric, Nathan, yay, nay for y'all?
How long do we get?
I think I need to read this whole thing over.
I'll just say that I'm really glad, even in the first chapter, it highlights a lot of the ideas and concepts that we talk about not only in seminary, but also we strive to talk about in Bible study. And he really does do a good job about talking about them so that people can understand them. When we're talking about the 3 languages of Aramaic, Greek, or Hebrew, all of these were swarming around that people knew backwards, forwards, and all of the above. So well so that when you said a different word, all of a sudden everyone was, oh yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. And today, for many of us, we don't always realize that because it's part of our regular language. However, we're also, I'll say, limited by only maybe knowing English or a few other words in other languages. So when we talk about it in such a way, then we're describing it with, I'll use the example of love because I've used that before. How in English we have love, but then you go to the Greek and there is literally 7 or 15 different versions of love. And when we think about that, well, okay, how do you describe that? I really like, we start adding those adverbs in there. And so I really appreciated that he's diving into a lot of those topics for us to explore, whether we've learned them before or whether we're learning them for a first time or we're relearning them. So I'll leave it at that.
Eric, what about you? Oh, Jim, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to ask the pastor, do you know how many different languages Jesus actually used in his ministry?
Ooh, great question. I don't know for sure. I don't know if that's ever been recorded that I'm aware of. Because he would have spent time in Egypt, he would have known some, Egyptian language. And 2, since they're at that crossroads of in Egypt or even in Israel, there are hundreds of languages being passed through there. It's hard to know. Or do you just know a little bit, kind of like I know a little bit of Spanish, I know a little bit of German, I know a little bit of French, that it can get me by, but I don't know it well enough to really say I'm fluent in it.
Well, and we keep forgetting that this is also a Roman province at the time, so there's Latin on top of all that.
I was wondering about that. So yep. I'm thinking Aramaic and Greek, perhaps Hebrew, Egyptian, and who knows what else?
Exactly.
Did the Samaritans have a different language as well?
That's one for Nathan.
Samaritans. So I'll say this is where it's hard to break down between where you're breaking it as a separate language versus a dialect or something along those lines. Because here again, they would have spoken some kind of Aramaic, but then they would have had other influences based on who their neighbors were and who they encountered. I'm not going to go so far as say it's a different language. I'll say it's a different dialect in my.
Well, and then kind of answering Scott's question, because I've been reading the chapter 2 to get ready for next week. But the thing that I'm not, that's why I made sure that I was thinking through this. But thing, also hearing all of y'all, like it, from the very beginning of this chapter, from the very beginning of this book, it gets down to the dirty details of things, of how we, as Kimball said, kind of gloss over certain things, and we forget it, and how it kind of puts it straight into our faces of going, I didn't know everything, and these guys didn't know everything, and how we have to relook at things and question things, and how immediate the questions start to happen, and how easy it is to start having a conversation with somebody else when you see it this way, of the immediation of just going for it. So that was kind of my thing, of just going like, yeah, and how different cultures can see this differently. Because of all the languages and all the, the layers of it, and how that can be confusing and all that as well. So that would be what I kind of took out of it.
Nice. So what I learned, real quick, actually go to the next slide, Nathan. So when I started going back through to figure out kind of prepping for this week, I went back to this slide and looked at the 12 apostles when they were called. And especially in Matthew, at chapter 10, verses 1 through 4, when Christ calls them, I looked at the teachings before and the teachings after of Christ's talk and what the disciples remember. The big one I picked up on is there's no parables before that. There's the Beatitudes, there's, the blessed are the sick, blessed are the humble. There's also then a whole section on an eye for an eye, love your enemies. But there's not really a moment of a true parable. Not until later on in chapter 13, verse 10, the disciples ask, why do you always teach in parables? That's the first parable the disciples actually remember. And it kind of made me realize it's probably because they didn't remember the parables from earlier, because they didn't get them. Like, why, if you think about like when you learn something, you remember the lessons, the moment you get it onward. And when Christ started explaining the parables is when he started figuring it out, or when they started actually remembering and figuring it out. And Kimball, I saw your hand raised a second ago.
Yes, I don't want to get off track, but in The Chosen, I asked a question that I felt like I'd missed something in Bible stories about Thomas being a wine merchant. And it was a poetic license, if you may, because we don't know. My learning curve is so steep right now. I want to make sure that when I read this, what is supposition and what is, I'm going to use a big phrase here, translated fact.
Yep.
Because we can all interpret things a little differently. And I don't really think what I'm asking for is important other than my context.
Well, we also have to remember that a lot of these translations of the Bible were done years ago. So even the connotation of the words today versus then are a little different. It's not that bad, not nearly as, say, trying to read it in the original Greek or Hebrew. and the loss that we've got from there. But we're also originally going from the Greek to Latin, and then the Greek was kind of forgotten, so that the Latin the Latin is what was used to translate to English, and now the newest ones are going back to the original Greek and Hebrew. Now I'm going to keep this slide in every week, just so that as we're moving forward and we're talking about the different points in for each of the disciples, we have this where we can go, okay, where was that in their moment of distinction? I probably actually should rewrite at least Peter's faith. That's where he declares, Christ, you are the Lord. Just heads up, that's the, try to set it in a smaller thing so it would fit, but that's one that doesn't fit well. Now, speaking of the Greek versus Hebrew or Aramaic, next slide is the apostellos. Now, I actually learned from, thanks to my mom and a resource she got me, the term apostolos, or more importantly, the Shalia, was actually used in the Old Testament as far back as Moses and Adam in Exodus. So this is a well-established term. Extremely well known. Everybody, when Christ called them apostles, would have gone, oh. Page 20 in my book. Yes. Thank you, Nathan.
Yep, that's where all this is conversation is. So if you want to follow along in your book, it's page 20.
Okay, thanks.
And just to kind of reestablish and lay down what this would have meant for the apostles. You know, the word, as it's explained kind of in the book, it means to send out. It means they were messengers, but not just messengers. They had authority. This is Christ saying, wherever you go and preach in my name, you're preaching as though you're me. So they should respect you as though you're me. Pharaoh would have had his own apostellos, or the Egyptian version of the word. And whenever they went into a place, they were shown the respect of Pharaoh. To not do that would be to insult Pharaoh himself, and that would start a war if it was another nation. And then I found it interesting that they separate apostolos, but it also falls into that same angelos. So they're both well known, kind of a different deviation, but come back to the original, which is messenger, and then the other one is ambassador. With the Shalia, again, that's just the Aramaic? Yeah, the Aramaic version of it. So the fact that they spoke both, that it is established all the way back in Exodus. Christ is saying, y'all are being sent from me, and I am sent from God. So they're being sent by God at this point, and they got it. It's the reason why you read the entire New Testament, or all of the different Gospels, and they're right there saying, who's the number one? Who's the top? Because they're already being placed above everybody else. Above the Pharisees and Sadducees, above the scribes, above the rabble. Christ has put them somewhere higher. And I know this whole book is trying to explain that they weren't, but they were given that title, and it went to their heads immediately. I can't say that really surprises me, because if somebody came and said, hey, yeah, you're the king, or you're going to be treated like a king everywhere you go, I'd get hot-headed real fast. But that also comes into asking the question of what authority were they actually were given? And I want you to think about that for a second. What was Christ giving them authority over? Anyone have a thought?
I think they were giving him, like he said, they could go and do what he did. So he'd be healing people. And that's the authority he got that from. Well, God gave him that authority, but they also had that authority. Like, what I can do, you will do also. And I think that's that's what makes me think of that anyway.
He did give them the authority of miracles.
And doing, like, laying on of hands, blessing people, casting out demons, all those things that Jesus did. They should be able to do the same thing. And that's kind of like, I guess we have that same authority too, if we follow those, if we don't fall into those same things that the apostles did, because they all fell into the, oh, well, I'm better than everybody else. So, you just can't do it that way. You have to have the humbleness of Christ and all those other things that he showed, instead of, saying, well, I'm in charge now. I don't know. Something like
it was also the doctrine that Jesus was preaching. So if they went and they preached about the Sermon on the Mount, or Beatitudes of various stories that Jesus would say, they had to make sure that adhered to what Jesus was portraying, and they couldn't just willy-nilly start interpreting it from their own feelings.
Correct. Apostolos were not allowed to break from what they were trained. So what the disciples were preaching was what Christ taught them first.
Right. I was thinking more along the lines when you said authority. I'm still struggling with that term. He charged them with sharing his message. Correct. Using the word charge as opposed to authority, because he gave them the authority to share the message. He gave them the authority to work miracles, which is part of showing compassion in God's will. But when I think of authority, I'm thinking of, I don't know, what I do, you so will do, but I'm still not you, and I'm not God. So I don't know that I have that authority. I'm struggling with that definition.
There is evidence of the disciples doing miracles. And actually, they're the miracles of the apostles and those who are close to them. It's in Acts. I'd have to look at. Nathan, do you remember any spots that it specifically?
Not right off the top of my head. For some reason, Acts 3, 4, and 5 would be your early church kind of time frame that I would probably go to first. And I think part of what this speaking with authority may also, this might give you some different insight into it, is when someone gives you a role to do, you also now have some power and authority and confidence to be able to really declare something. So in some regards, they're exercising that confidence to be able to grow into it, and not only grow into it, but really understand and know it. So it's one thing to be able to say, you're going to be able to go and help someone. It's a whole different story if you go help someone and they look back at you with their eyes filled with tears and saying, you really made a difference in my life today. All of a sudden, that authority, that confidence, that charge, it is just, it's yours. And are you now aware of it?
And Nathan, it Acts 3:1. So it was very soon after. Yeah, it's like almost you went to seminary or something. But anyway, I haven't read it, but my title says Peter heals the crippled beggar.
Sure.
So I'm shocked that it was Peter, of course, but anyway. And the other point that I was going to throw out was, I'm reminded of that verse, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth is loosed in heaven. And there's a couple of different notes I have in my Bible about different people have kind of interpreted whether it's a past, present participle or a past, whatever it is that might kind of adjust it. But every time I hear that, I think, oh my goodness, we really have to be careful what we say, because the full weight of things that we do and things that we say is exactly who people think Christ. If they don't know him, if they knew him, they would know that. But if you have to, be careful about that.
And that's actually where the word Christian comes from, Christ-like, or little Christs. And that's a testament to the young church that people would see them exactly as little Christ-like figures. Maybe not, raising the dead, but their attitudes and the way they viewed the world were reminiscent enough that people said, yeah, they walked with Christ. They learned from Christ.
So, Scott, I have an answer to your question that satisfies my lack of understanding. Matthew 10:1, he called his 12 disciples, gave them authority over unclean spirits, to throw them out, and to heal every disease and every sickness.
Yeah. That's the miracle side.
Yep.
But they also were given that authority on earth that Christ had on earth. Christ was sent from the Father. I'm not saying that they were given that same authority of God the Father. What I'm saying is Christ was sent from God to be his emissary on earth and to show us into the new covenant. And the disciples, the apostles, really, let's keep the word straight since they do matter, were sent by Christ to share that message, to share the new covenant. But to actually go back to the disciples leaving because of the eat my body and drink my blood, actually the reason that a lot of early atheists thought that the Christians were cannibals. They also thought that they were incestuous because everyone introduced themselves as, this is my wife, Sister Mary, this is my brother. And at that point, there was just confusion because of the terminology, but they did understand they were brothers and sisters in Christ. They did understand body and blood, where we've now, basically split denomination-wise, where some say it's only body and blood, some say that it's only bread and wine. Us, we obviously, say it's all four. But that's where the interpretation and the confusion over 2,000 years. Had we sat with Jesus or had we sat with the disciples, we might have understood a little better. As we're learning more about the disciples and reading them, the Bible, not just as the Bible, but as the testimony, as the eyewitness accounts, changes our perspective entirely and our learning of what we believe. And so jumping kind of to the next slide, for me, I asked last week about the path the disciples took from disciples to apostles and how it kind of related to present day for us. But it is worth noting the path the disciples took in becoming the apostles and then beyond. They were just the casual students, as we've seen. They were then disciples who followed, but not necessarily followed, dropped everything. He called them to be apostles, sent them on short-term missions. They had kind of a small group setting. As we can see from the chapter I pointed out, once parables are mentioned in the Bible, that's when Christ starts explaining the parables to them. Before that, they kind of get here's a new law, don't murder. Being angry at a friend or at your brother is murder. It's not until later when they start really getting the meat, the depth of Christ's teaching, because they're sitting with Christ who's explaining it to them, that they start to understand what it really is, what this new covenant's going to be. And they're slow. He has to tell them over and over again, how do you not believe? Like, he's performing miracles in front of them, and they still don't believe. They still don't get it. He explains the kingdom of heaven is like 50,000 different things. I know I'm exaggerating, but go throughout the New Testament. It's the kingdom of heaven is like a pearl. The kingdom of heaven is like a coin. The kingdom of heaven, over and over again, and they don't get it. They're not going to get it until the 40 days is up, Christ ascends, Holy Spirit comes into their lives, and they go, oh. And even then they mess up, because we're human. But I also feel like that's kind of part of God's plan and his understanding of us. The disciples messed up, the apostles. So do we. But the apostles still managed to establish the kingdom on earth. They still accomplished the goal Christ sent them out to do. We can do the same. We've been called to continue that mission. We are going to mess up, but we will keep going. And we will do as God commanded, because God understands and goes, yep, I got this. Nothing on earth, all God. And that's where they finally became the church founders. It started with this, Peter going out and preaching and saving 3,000. But when we really do look at what happened over decades, they went out, they went on missionary trips. They figured out what worked and what didn't. They argued about what worked and what didn't in Book of Acts, and argued about how what one person was doing was actually hurting the message in a different place. It's where Peter eating with Gentiles happens, and Paul having to go, no. God called you to do that, so do that. And when you look at what they had to learn, it's the same things we have to learn. Spiritual understanding, humility. I forgot who mentioned it earlier, but these are the 5 points somebody else mentioned. Faith, commitment, and power. And when you kind of dive deeper in both looking at their transformation, but then hopefully next time you decide to read the Gospels and start digging through, you'll kind of understand, like, these were just rural farmers, fishermen, tax collector. The tax collector probably the only one who really had an education of any sort. And the rest, they had no idea what they were learning. They knew who he was. They knew what he was saying he was and what would happen, sort of. They knew kingdom of God. They knew that they were being called apostles. They were being called the new heads of the church. Literally the kings under the king. But they had no idea what all that would mean. That kind of sums up what I had to talk about tonight. Does anyone have anything else to add? Yes, Eric.
Well, hearing you talk, bringing back up the steps that he goes through in the beginning, which is followers, disciples, apostles, and then he eventually goes into martyrdom.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of talked about this, Scott, later this after we met. We talked about how martyrdom can be a scary thing for us as modern people, and I was thinking about it of going in something different, that when we think we know it all, or that I guess the greatest example would be is actually in the book. It's in the first section of the readings when William, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, actually translates the Greek and the Hebrew into English for the first time. He saw that there was something wrong within ourselves and within the church. And he went out to try to change that. And he ends up eventually getting actually martyred. But I think that's something as us, as people in faith, we have to shed off of those other things. And that's a part of being our own martyr and that. So that, I don't know. Listening you talk about it today, Scott, just reminded me of that. So.
Well, and the other half of it is remember that Christ called us to pick up our cross daily, to sacrifice ourselves. So martyrdom from a Christian standpoint is death of our old self as we learn and grow and figure out what God is calling us so that we can be resurrected in the image of God the way he wants. It doesn't matter if it's understanding that the disciples were idiots. It doesn't matter if we figure out we don't pray enough or we've walked away from him in our daily life, that we need to stop cutting people off, while driving or rushing through the supermarket. We've been called to realize what our sin is and to ask for that forgiveness, to allow those sins to die. As Peter likes to say, I'm the chief of sinners. My flesh is weak, but the spirit's willing. It's through God that we can. So yeah, Eric, I understand martyrdom's scary, but for me, it's an understanding of kind of what Christ's message really was. To forsake the earth or our earthly selves and to look towards the kingdom of heaven. Does anyone else have a thought? Last minute opinions?
I wanted to, I was looking at the training, and I'm kind of going to piggyback a little bit on what Kimball was talking about. I feel like I'm in a huge learning curve, and I feel like I've been tested recently. And I look at this list, and I realize I'm learning everything all over again. Pardon me.
I understand, Mom. I learned all this. Started the learning of this from Chris.
Those are good things.
Absolutely. It's part of that binding together of generations, of children teaching parents, brothers and sisters learning from each other and growing together. And this is part of that learning that we do, that as even the disciples, when you don't get it right, that's okay. And we still come back together and we learn and we grow together. And in the midst of it all, we'll always be together.
Amen to that.
So often when I was looking at this, it was, okay, once you graduated from followers, now you're ready for disciples. Once you graduated from followers, now you're ready to be an apostle. And yet I'm reminded over and over again that Peter especially, who always would put his foot in his mouth, would find himself going from an apostle back to a follower in understanding things. And Jesus would say, let's talk about that. Come on, off to the side here. And he would take him one-on-one and remind him, let's go through it again. And even as Lutherans, that's one of the reasons why we had that small catechisms. What are the basic foundations? Let's go over it again. It's why we celebrate Christmas and Easter every single year. Let's go over it again. How are we reminded that Christ comes into the world, dies for the sake of the world, and yet lives for the world after his death?
And I'll repeat. Any last comments, opinions, thoughts? Any perspective that I didn't bring up? All right. Well, next week is...
I'll chime in with one, actually.
Yes, sir.
This is the this is the one time I'll just say this is be like Peter. Be bold and ask the questions and say, this is what I know, this is what I had learned. And just like we did at the very beginning, hey, it's something we all need to hear again and again and again. And sometimes we'll say, yep, I heard that too, and it was great. And other times, and I saw some of you doing it, oh yeah, that was a good one too. I'll put a star next to it. I'll underline it too. And that's a great way of having Bible study, of learning from each other, growing together, and to be those disciples from follower to disciple, because apostle, it's hard. Not everyone wants to do it. And even when you are called to be an apostle, it's tough. And sometimes you want to go, can I just be a disciple again? Or a follower.
I was about to say, I was like, let's go back to follower first.
Yeah.
And I sit in the pew, listen to the sermon.
I go with that.
I'm only a disciple on certain occasions.
So the next slide, real quick. Not going to really talk about this because next week is when we finally get into the first disciple, really start the bulk of this. And in case you haven't read the title of it, it is Peter, the apostle with the foot-shaped mouth. I know I mentioned it once before. But this was probably one of my favorite chapters just because it did really feel like it was the most apt named. It also kind of showed me a little bit into Christ's personality and his training methods. So jumping to that last slide, very last one, the schedule. To make sure that we are on that same page, because I see I did the life experiences. It is the life experiences that shape a true leader.
So we're reading until page 46, and there's a break in that.
If you have hardcover, yeah. The character qualities that define. The character qualities that define a true leader. Do not read that. Can't stop there. Unless Eric, you
read it or don't read it.
Do not read
to that point. That's where the break is. So this is a large chapter, just like the first one is. So we have broken it up into two different.
Okay.
Yeah. It's going to be very hard. So if you do want to read the entirety of it, go right ahead. Like I said, it is this, as Scott said, is one of those chapters that you just want to keep eating up. But what I would say is if you do feel like you want to go further in it, you might want to start back from the very beginning of it, a day later, because this is the meat and bones of this book, of a lot of the Bible. Peter is the second mentioned person in the Gospels besides Jesus. It goes Jesus, and then it goes Simon Peter. So we know a lot about Peter. So this is a very in-depth chapter, and there's a lot in it. So I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Well, then we'll end with the Lord's Prayer. If anyone would like to lead it, to volunteer.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth and as in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those for others. Finish.
And lead us not to temptation, but deliver us from evil.
For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever
and ever.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for all your work.
Oh, thank you.
Mom, maybe you and I ought to be
Yeah, good work, guys. And Mom. Yep.
I'm talking to Mom over there.
Cindy, that's you. You should be proud.
Maybe we ought to be study partners.
It has been fun because every time that Mom does